Okay, welcome back. And it looks like I am on my own again. This is the Tuesday noontime Zoom, and yeah, I appear to be here to be all by myself. And so, since if I had a bunch of people here, I'd probably be doing a review for the final exam, but otherwise, I'm just going to go ahead and cover the next lecture, which is the start of Unit 9, the art historical lecture for Unit 9, which is on the end of Romanticism and the beginning, primarily, the beginning of modernism. And so, one of the main things for us to get from this lecture is how what we think of as the beginning of modernism, what we think modernist art looks like, is different than actually where art historians uh, draw the line. So we draw the line at the beginning of modernism with the realist movement, which is primarily Courbet and some other artists, primarily in France. And that's kind of the start of modernism in painting and primarily in visual arts. And so most of what we look at for this lecture will probably seem completely not like modern art to most of you. In fact, let's just very quickly go through and we'll just kind of just to prove my point, right? So, doesn't look like modern art, but it's modern art. This is modern art. This is modern art. This is modern art. It's modern, 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 modern. It's all very modern art. Doesn't necessarily feel like modern art because it's not what we think modern art looks like, but this is the start of modernism. And it's not until we get to here, to Monet, where we start to get artwork that looks enough avant-garde, enough um, unusual to us that we think, oh, okay, I can understand that as modern art. And even still, we're doing the way more than just the first half of modernism. None of this is, shocking, like the way we think modern art should be shocking. So there's a lecture. We just looked at all of it. And so that's my first point. First point is just to kind of get a sense of how, when we say modernist and modern, that we mean slightly different things of what people mean when they're using the word modern in an everyday vernacular kind of way. Um, Modernism as an art movement, like um, like Romanticism, it's a lot about some shared ideas about, and not so much about theme, but about art and about the artist. There's this fundamental idea in, and about, to a degree, also about culture, right? There's a fundamental belief built into modernism, which is that human culture is progressive, that things tend towards getting better, more advanced, more developed, and that that's a good thing, that's a movement towards the future and towards a better and better world, right? That that history and culture is progressive, meaning that moving towards progress. That is kind of a built-in assumption to modernism. And then built into that is this idea that the artist, if you remember how the Romantics had a model of the artist as being kind of like set aside from society, right? The artist was automatically, by their nature, by their sensitivity, they were automatically misunderstood by society, by culture. But they were also the ones who brought culture. Well, this idea kind of continues, but in a new form in modernism, where the artist is not so much seen as apart, separate from society, but instead more ahead of, right? The modernist point of view about the artist is that the artist is the avant-garde, right? A lot of this comes out of a particular essay by what was that? Concerning the spiritual and art by, oh, I'm blanking. We'll get to him next lecture. Uh, Russian guy. Anyway, um, that the idea that the artist is, or the artists, plural, are the people who are kind of coming up with the new culture, and they're basically living in the culture of the future today, right? That they're pushing towards where culture is going to go, in terms of how art looks and everything. And then, um, and then related to that is also an idea that's not initially in modernism, but developed somewhere along the way about the idea that part of the point of this is artworks becoming more true to their essential nature, right? So somewhere along the lines, it becomes important for painting to be more about painting and less about history and literature and references to other culture, right? The painting should be true to painting, which means it should be about what painting is. And painting is about being colors put on a flat canvas. Painting shouldn't aim to be architecture. Painting shouldn't aim to be sculpture. Painting should just be painting. And similarly for all art forms, right? Okay. So that's basically the story we're going to see here. That last part about kind of like the essentialism of disciplines and kind of aiming for kind of like purity as a way of moving towards progress, that we're going to see much more in the second half of modernism. If I even get to do that lecture this semester, the lecture on high modernism. But for right now, we're just dealing with where we are right here. So one of the things we can see right here with the start with Courbet is at the beginning, we're not that far off from Romanticism, right? This is a self-portrait as a young man of Courbet. And in it, he's, like here is the man who's going to be the start of modernism, the start and the voice of realism. And yet, this is a very romantic image. So we all begin somewhere, and Courbet began influenced by Romanticism, influenced by Géricault, influenced by Delacroix. But Courbet was right from the start also very much his own man. And so painting these paintings that are, and they are realist in a couple of ways. The most important way is that they are not shying away from parts of society that are not, absolutely wealthy. We're here at a burial. It's clearly not a wealthy burial because of the way the grave is cut, or um, the, not all the people look like they're all that wealthy. We'll get back to this one for a second. And so Courbet is primarily known for both not only being a realist in terms of wanting to keep the by the way, notice this. This is very clever. I had just noticed this as I was looking. Look at the way the cross right there being held, right? And with the crucifix on it, the way it kind of fits into the landscape. It's like a subtle little choice of Courbet. Courbet was, um, like he was so adamant about being a realist, right? And only painting what he saw. He famously someone once said, like, why do you never have like angels in your paintings, right? Like you could imagine this same painting, but the heavens could be filled with angels, right? Why do you never have, and he once said to someone, as soon as you show me an angel, I will paint it, right? So not wanting to paint things that are not physical, tangible things he can see in the real world. And yet he also hints at kind of a visionary sort of approach where that cross that's being held there by this man is also kind of ties into the landscape in a clever sort of way. So it's realist primarily because it's part of this idea of social realism, which is the idea of um, showing society and showing the both the good and the bad, the rich and the poor, especially the poor, being willing to show kind of like everything in society underneath the top privileged people. But he also had some fanciful elements to him. This is another kind of self-portrait. This is a painting called The Painter's Studio, and in it he is sort of painting. He's painting a landscape painting towards the end of his life, he focused a lot on landscape painting, and he loved painting landscapes. And he's painting a landscape painting, but in it, he's kind of like you can see what he has is he's had like all these different um, people, right? Like there's a a model, like an artist model, but she's kind of playing the role of being the muse. And there's family here and friends, right? But there's also just people he remembers and like a hint of a mural that's painted on the back wall that is also a hint of a landscape space that might be kind of like the landscape he remembers from childhood. And so in this painting, he's sort of kind of like talking about how he goes into the painting studio, but he brings all of these influences with him. So another artist who is sort of this transition from a very early version of modernism, which is very tied to realism, and is more of a transitional figure between that into impressionism, is Fantin Latour, who's one of my favorite painters. You might notice that I use his self-portrait, no, his portrait of Manet. I use that as part of my YouTube channel. That's like the icon for my YouTube channel. I think that's just a gorgeous painting. Um, and Fantin Latour is just a unbelievable, excellent painter. Here's a self-portrait, and then here's a group of young artists. It's called By the Table. And there's him again in his. And then this one, we have Manet here, who is teaching, right? And Manet was older than a lot of these young painters, older than Fantin Latour, but was also in some ways more avant-garde than they were. Like Fantin Latour was more conservative, more restrained. I love the still life paintings of Fantin Latour as well. We've already seen this print, right? When I talked about lithography, and I think it's pairs really nicely with that painting. And these two paintings are just about some of my favorite paintings of all time. They're just absolutely gorgeous. The colors on this, the restraint to the color, the ability to make such a limited palette feel so real and colorful is just astounding. So Manet kind of like was the towering figure over this early period and was the great influence. And he painted much looser, much and much more just directly, and was very much about um, trying to encourage others to paint loosely and directly. So, but he was also related to um, this realism movement in the fact that he was quite interested in showing kind of like French society things that they weren't necessarily used to seeing. And so the idea of these three people having a picnic, and for whatever reason she is not wearing any clothes, which was considered very shocking to upper class polite society, or his portrait painting here, Olympia, of a woman who was a well-known courtesan, prostitute, escort. Um, and and so painting subject matter that is kind of like considered taboo, being willing to sort of show the uncomfortable or to show something that's a little bit shocking, especially if you can also be true. Although it's kind of an interesting thing because it's like the dead toreador, but it's not like the toreador was painted at a bullfight. This was maybe from a memory, but then recreated, set up in the studio with a model. But here we have a painting that really does feel like it is about like a real life observation and a commentary on a real life kind of social situation and sort of kind of telling polite French society, look at these people. And so this is very much about her and about the barmaids at this particular establishment. And she looks so kind of exhausted. Meanwhile, in um, in American painting, although not painting done in America primarily, when we're talking about American painting at this time, a lot of it was done in England or in France. because primarily we're talking about John Singer Sargent and Whistler, who were both primarily living in England at this time, but also traveling Europe. So with American painting, we have kind of also this idea of kind of like trying to find this space in between realism and a little bit more of a loose hand, letting the paint be a little bit flatter. We've already seen Madame X once. This painting, this one here of the Flamingo Dancer, that one's at the Gardner Museum. That's just a gorgeous painting. And then Whistler as well was also painting mostly in Britain and was kind of like looking for ways to paint, looser. This particular painting of water and fireworks got got a created a whole kind of crises in art where a critic criticized the exhibition and criticized Whistler, the artist, for essentially, I think he accused him of like throwing pots of paint in the eye of the public. And so then Whistler sued him. And, but, like Whistler was very much trying to remind people that painting is really just compositions in color, that making the paintings about stuff, right? Like this famous painting, which many people know by the title Whistler's Mother, but was never called Whistler's Mother, right? The title of the piece is Arrangement in Gray and Black #1, which sounds like the title of a completely abstract painting. And that was Whistler's point. His point was this is a completely abstract painting. The fact that it has a figure in it is secondary to its real value. Its real value is in the organization of values, colors, right? Decisions about changes of warm to cool gray. So the one American here that was actually living in America is Thomas Eakins. And we have seen this painting once before in the Tell It Like It Is lecture. I think that was previous unit 8. And that also ties into Edgar Degas, because although Degas was a French painter, he also lived in America briefly. This painting here, the Bellili family, was painted in New Orleans while he was living in New Orleans for, I think, a couple of years. We've already seen this drawing multiple times. It's been in multiple tests and various lectures talked about it for various issues. Okay, so getting back to France, we start to see this move towards, so how do we get from here, well, let's say here, really, to here? And the primary difference, right, is artists were getting more and more interested in painting outdoors. Let's look at Manet one more time because we do have at least one example of a early Manet landscape, right? So artists were starting to realize that if painting is really just about organizing colors and shapes to make light, the best place to go to see things where you can be inspired and really kind of raise your game, so to speak, in terms of how you can organize light and dark shapes to make believable sense of atmosphere and space and light. The best place to go is the landscape instead of painting in the studio. So getting outside, painting studies, but also sometimes painting big, you know, full paintings. This, by the way, here, this painting is at the Met. I've seen it multiple times, and they have a couple of Pissarro paintings there at the Met. And so this is where we start to see some paintings by Monet, right? And so this early Monet feels very much like what we were, coming out of that same tradition of Manet and Pissarro, and not that different from Morisot. I loved Morisot, by the way. There's a quality to Morisot's painting that reminds me a lot of the American landscape painter Innes. But then Monet starts to move in a different direction. And we've already talked about the Rouen Cathedral paintings in the lecture on color, where I went into a lot more detail about them. But the main point here is just that the realism of the beginning parts of this modernist movement, right, was very much about social realism. But by the time we get here, artists were becoming much more interested in optical realism, in actually really paying attention to the way actual color works in actual light and actual space. And so there's a strong connection between what Monet is doing here and then what Seurat is doing here, right? They're both very much, Seurat's doing it in a much more kind of mechanical and precise and almost like scientific experiment sort of way, but they're both really interested in the way that color works, both out in the world and then on a painting. How does it work in terms of making us believe in the color in the painting be a representation of the color in the world? I love these light Seurat's. But anyway, getting back. So this is we're starting to have this much more interest in optical realism, like how do things. In fact, I think someone once said, with some famous quote about Monet, someone like it was a quote where it was like praising a number of the French Impressionist artists, so and so is this and so and so is that, and then said Monet was just an eye. But oh, what an eye, right? And the idea being that like he was after just looking, not judging, not doing anything about just looking and really seeing. And it's only when you are really carefully looking that you can start to see color changes like that. Amazing. But this also leads to what eventually will be called like the post-impressionist. I don't think actually I even have. Yeah, I left out Gauguin out of this. Probably shouldn't have. So Van Gogh and Gauguin are the two artists that we most associate with the beginning of this post-impressionist, and they are in some ways related to what's going on here. But unlike Seurat, where what Seurat is taking is the color theory and the idea of being true to the optical, the light nature of color, being true to the fact that color is light. For Van Gogh, it was much more about being true to the fact that paint is mark, right? That and a painting is just a series of strokes and marks of thick, gooey stuffs that has a color that you stick on a surface. And in some ways, Van Gogh is the stronger influence in that when we get to um, high high modernism, that is the thing that's going to be the most the the idea of just painting is paint on a surface. It's just about the application of the stuff, right? That's going to be the thing that people take away um, from Van Gogh more than anything else. Although there's a lot more here. I mean, Van Gogh just as a means of exploring harmony. Um, Yeah, Van Gogh's a genius. And like I said before, I love these late Seurat paintings. Um, there's one of these at the Indianapolis Art Museum that I've seen. Actually, one time I was at the Indianapolis Art Museum and they had the four last paintings, which included one of the ones of Seurat, and they got the other three. They had an exhibition just of those four paintings. It was a small exhibition, like relatively small room, and just one wall in the room had the four paintings. The rest of the exhibition was just a collection of notebooks and studies and everything, mostly on in tables, right? The four paintings were the only things, and then maybe one didactic display which had words on it. Only things on the wall anywhere. It was a gorgeous little exhibition. And years later, I was teaching at Mississippi State, teaching a class on galleries and gallery management. And I found an article from a magazine that was on that exact exhibition. And I was like, yeah, I was there. So also, the Met has one of these late paintings and a couple of others that are very close to the same time period. And and then lastly, of the post-impressionists, we need to talk about Cezanne. And Cezanne probably is the most influential in terms of what happens next. Incredibly influential on Picasso and on Braque, and because so influential on those two artists, and then their development of Cubism, and then how influential that was on everyone else. So, if Seurat was primarily taking the lesson from Monet about the optical nature of color and being truthful and realistic about the optical nature of light and color. And if Van Gogh was primarily about being truthful to the physical nature of paint, Cezanne was being kind of like truthful a little bit about both of those things, but also about this is a hard one to sum up. I would say that like what Cezanne was aiming for was like a kind of art that was truthful about the physicalness of the world and the completely ephemeral unphysicalness of our perception of the world, if that makes sense, right? That he wanted it to feel like these were paintings about really solid physical things, but that undermined the idea that our view of those things was anything solid or tangible because it's not. So there's both this sense of like solidity and weight to everything, and then at the same time, kind of like a sense, you see it especially maybe in certain passages here, a sense of like the solidity is built up out of multiple moments of time, multiple views, multiple looks. And then in a way that's true of how reality actually works, right? That the stuff is real, but we only perceive it through moments. Anyway, that is the end of that lecture. That's the first half of modernism. And was there anyone who joined me? No, it looks like it was me the whole time. Okay, so hopefully tonight, because tonight might be the last night for me to do a review because I'm going to be on the road all day tomorrow. So if you want to have a review for the test, you might have to do it sometime tonight. Okay, and it might be a bit late. Okay, thank you very much.